The Hepworth Wakefield sits at the heart of the city's conservation area, on the headland of the River Calder. The building is formed from a conglomeration of 10 individually sized blocks, designed in response to the scale and roof lines of the surrounding industrial buildings. The material used is a special pigmented concrete, Hepworth brown, chosen to emphasise the sculptural appearance of the building. Inside, the emphasis is on light and space. Big open galleries with carefully placed windows. Simple and unfussy, this is bold modern architecture, a building which feels in complete harmony with Hepworth's work.
It took a long time for me to find my own personal way of making sculpture. A long time to discover the purest forms which would express the timelessness of primitive forces, either in nature or in the human spirit.
The first gallery exists to place Hepworth in the context of her British contemporaries, such as Henry Moore, and indeed the context of European modern art. She was familiar with the work of constructivist sculptors such as Naum Garbo, artists such as Constantin Brancusi, the inventors of this new language that had transformed sculpture during the first 30 years of the 20th century. But what does Hepworth use that language for? I think essentially, she's drawn to two ideas. She's drawn to the idea of primal form. Look at these two standing stones. To me, they're like pebbles that have been washed smooth by the sea. It's as if she wants to encapsulate that experience and present it on a plinth. The other thing I think that fascinates her is the notion of primal emotion, using sculpture somehow to express the most basic human feelings. And here, in this really beautiful early Hepworth, she's created an image of the mother and child from such simple means, from two stones that look almost as if they've been weathered in such a way that they nestle into each other. It's beautifully simple and, I think, quintessentially Hepworth.
The centrepiece of the gallery is the Hepworth Family Gift, a collection of 44 full-size working models in plaster and aluminium made in preparation for the finished originals in bronze. These prototypes allow us for the first time to gain a greater understanding of how Hepworth worked with her material.
I like this display of Hepworth's tools. You get a wonderful sense of just how tactile Hepworth's engagement with her material was. And I really like this little circular cheese grater. She used that to roughen the surface of the plaster too, so she was also a great improviser.
The tools a sculptor uses become intensely personal to one, the most precious extensions of one's sight and touch.
One of the most impressive structures in the collection is the 6-metre-high model and prototype for winged figure. The original was commissioned by John Lewis for their flagship store on Oxford Street, where it still hangs today.
Hepworth, once again, the improviser, has used car body filler on the inside, I think perhaps to create a texture suggestive of feathers. In fact, the whole model reminds me of a pair of angel's wings. Perhaps that's what we should think of it as, the angel of Oxford Street. The big question raised by this display, indeed by the whole existence of the Hepworth Wakefield, is why did the artist decide that she wanted to preserve these maquettes, these models? Because after all, she didn't need to. The finished sculpture that was made from this still exists, it's in the world. But it's a very different thing. It's a large, dark green, weathered bronze. This is something much more fragile. And I think Hepworth, whose life was not entirely straightforward, whose life was in many ways quite a troubled one, she recognized that the emotions at the heart of her work were indeed fragile and vulnerable things.
Hepworth's creativity was inevitably linked to her vulnerability as a mother. She had a son with her first husband, the sculptor John Skeeping, and then triplets with the artist Ben Nicholson. In order to pursue her career as a sculptor, she placed the triplets in a home for a while, a move that attracted fierce criticism. When the children were older, the whole family settled in St Ives. But Hepworth suffered deeply when Nicholson left her in 1951. Then, in 1953, her eldest son, Paul, was killed in a plane crash. That Hepworth created so many of her finest works during such difficult times is a testament to her extraordinary talent and determination. But the Hepworth Wakefield isn't just about this collection of maquettes and a new gallery space. It's also about bringing the artist back to her roots, to the countryside that first inspired her.
Hepworth was one of the first modern British artists to place the experience of landscape absolutely at the centre of her work. And I think what she was trying to recreate or to evoke throughout her life was some sense of the fusion between the human figure and the human spirit and the larger forces of nature.
All my early memories are of forms and shapes and textures. I remember moving through the landscape with my father in his car, and the hills were sculptures. The roads defined the forms. There was the sensation of moving through the hollows and slopes of peaks and dales, feeling, seeing, touching through the mind, the eye and the hand.
Sometimes I think your earliest experiences leave the deepest and the strongest traces, and looking at these extraordinary rock formations thrust out of the soil, it's hard not to think that Hepworth did indeed carry the memory of these sculpture-like forms with her throughout her life. I think this really is, as she herself said, where it all began.
Sculpture, rock, myself, and the landscape. This sensation has never left me. I, the sculptor, am the landscape.